Mr. Speaker, when the House met a year ago to debate the estimates of revenues and expenditures, the scale of the devastation of COVID-19 on the global, regional, and local economy was uncertain. What we know now, Mr. Speaker, is that not only has COVID-19 proven to be one of the worst health catastrophes in history, but it has also proven to be the most destructive economic crisis the world has seen since the Great Depression of the 1930s. Our major trading partners, Mr. Speaker, all suffered untold economic contraction due to the force of what we refer to today as the Great Lockdown Recession. In the United Kingdom, GDP declined by 9.9%, the worst in almost 300 years. Whilst the US economy, Mr. Speaker, slumped by 3.5%, the largest decline since the Second World War. Despite a 4% growth in the last quarter of 2020, the Canadian economy, Mr. Speaker, contracted by 5.4%, the worst economic decline on record since 1961. In the Caribbean, Mr. Speaker, there is also significant economic distress and pain. Whilst in St. Lucia, COVID-19 was solely responsible for displacing a whopping 15,000 jobs, 279 million in government revenue. According to the summary page of the estimates of revenues and expenditure, GDP declined from 5.36 billion to 4.2 billion, Mr. Speaker, in economic performance. Some 1.1 billion in economic activity disappeared, all because of the global pandemic. However, Mr. Speaker, I observe that some 7,400 jobs have returned within the tourism sector, hit hardest by COVID-19. I also reflect on the many thousands that are still out of work and many in other sectors. There is just a general reduction, Mr. Speaker, in the income levels of workers across St. Lucia, and it is them that we seek to give hope as we start to prepare this year's estimates. Mr. Speaker, the vendors in the arcade and the craft market have not earned an income since March 2020. And whilst the fruit and vegetable vendors have been earning a living, their income levels are significantly reduced. COVID, Mr. Speaker, has made it extremely difficult to encourage economic activity whilst seeking to manage the movement and gathering of large groups of individuals. Hotel workers today, Mr. Speaker, even those that are employed, are doing so at reduced hours. Bus drivers are also finding it tough to make profits, as they too are having to sacrifice by traveling with significantly reduced loads. Mr. Speaker, it was with the workers of this country in mind and the ongoing efforts to manage the global pandemic that the Cabinet of Ministers sat with the Minister of Finance and his team to contemplate the immediate economic future of St. Lucia. We observed, Mr. Speaker, that tax revenue fell by 279 million in the current financial year, and GDP contracted by 20%, Mr. Speaker, from the previous financial year, to a projected outturn of 4.2 billion in this financial year. This would represent over 1.1 billion, as I've stated, in economic decline. Despite these fiscal pressures, Mr. Speaker, we're still able to pay every single month of salaries. Never defaulted, Mr. Speaker, on our debt obligations. Nor did we, Mr. Speaker, neglected our obligations to provide critical services like healthcare, education, and national security to our people. The international reputation of St. Lucia, Mr. Speaker, is still very much intact. And yes, Mr. Speaker, we have and we will continue to defeat the cancer of COVID-19 on our population. Mr. Speaker, under Head 53 of the Department of Health, over $189 million is projected to be spent in the upcoming financial year as we undertake the vaccination phase of our fight against COVID-19. Mr. Speaker, as of March 15th, the latest figures from the Ministry of Health suggested that over 19,263 St. Lucians, or over 10% of our population, have been vaccinated successfully, receiving their first dose. Mr. Speaker, the lab at the Owen King EU Hospital has crushed the backlog of tests, reducing the number of swabs in the lab to 0 and returning us, Mr. Speaker, to a less than 24-hour processing time. Mr. Speaker, the forensic lab has been mobilized to join the fight of testing in COVID-19, bringing the daily capacity collectively between Owen King EU and the forensic lab to over 1,000 tests that we're able to do on a daily basis. As of March 16th, Mr. Speaker, we have seen that the number of active cases continue to slide significantly. Today, I'm happy to report that the number of active cases stand at 158. Mr. Speaker, we have broken the back of the COVID curve. And so, Mr. Speaker, I find it very hard to accept that we have mismanaged this pandemic. I find it very hard when I hear members say that we are an uncaring government. Mr. Speaker, it is because we care. We continue to condemn reckless actions like having political marches in the middle of the pandemic. Mr. Speaker, we continue to see an overwhelming number of positive cases. Thankfully, recover at an encouraging rate of over 99% of all of our cases, Mr. Speaker. But unfortunately, 55 of our citizens are no longer with us. And we sympathize with those families, Mr. Speaker, as they go through the grief and pain that we all would in losing a loved one. Incidentally, Mr. Speaker, today is the day, a second anniversary of the death of my own father, who didn't pass away because of COVID. But the pain and the sorrow that my family feel is just as difficult. And so, Mr. Speaker, I want to reject every suggestion from the opposition that we do not understand. I want to reject every suggestion, Mr. Speaker, that we do not care. Our sympathies and our deepest condolences are with those families. But we're committed to, Mr. Speaker, is ensuring in this fiscal year that we appropriate the adequate resources to give to the people in the Ministry of Health so that they can adequately manage the COVID-19 fight required to prevent more people from dying. That is our number one objective as we debate the current estimates and expenditures. Mr. Speaker, amid this dark time in the world, there is hope for our economy, hope for our public health, and hope in these estimates totaling over $1.6 billion in program that are necessitated by the times. Mr. Speaker, our key source markets are on target for vaccinating their populations, as in the United States, 72.1 million have received their first dose, And in the United Kingdom, our second largest market, some 24 million have been vaccinated. This, Mr. Speaker, makes it a lot safer and easier to manage tourism and create jobs and opportunity for small businesses in the context of the COVID pandemic. Mr. Speaker, page 340 of the estimates of revenues and expenditures of the financial year 2021 to 2022 has justifiably proposed to spend some $14,501,400 in capital projects in various tourism programs. This comes amid significant pent-up demand for travel and tourism around the world. Mr. Speaker, our hotels are already reporting significant increases in bookings. As early as April, Mr. Speaker, some hotels are reporting up to 60%. Mr. Speaker, airlines are lining up at record levels to resume flights to St. Lucia, so much so that this summer we will experience a 15% increase in air seats coming to St. Lucia when compared to our pre-COVID levels back in 2019. This is a most extraordinary accomplishment, Mr. Speaker, given the times. And the programs outlined in the estimates is our deep conviction that the tourism industry and our tourism workers would eventually bounce back. Mr. Speaker, I am obligated to give this Honorable House a very detailed update on where the flights are coming from. Mr. Speaker, in the United States, JetBlue out of Newark, New Jersey is starting early June. And this is for the first time in the history that that airline will be operating a direct service from Newark to St. Lucia. Mr. Speaker, there's more confidence coming from American Airlines because they have just announced, Mr. Speaker, and placed on their system that for the first time in the history of tourism in St. Lucia, that they'll be operating a direct flight between St. Lucia and Dallas, Texas Airport. Mr. Speaker, even as we grapple with the challenges of COVID-19, American Airlines have just announced that they will be reinstating direct service between JFK and St. Lucia, Mr. Speaker. Additional airlift coming to our shores. Mr. Speaker, American Airlines has also reported other good news, and that is that they will be announcing and running for the first time in the history a summer flight out of the city of Philadelphia. Mr. Speaker, a flight that would run from winter to spring. Mr. Speaker, we cannot ignore the fact that there is significant demand for our wonderful country. We cannot, Mr. Speaker, ignore the fact that many of our workers continue to feel the pinch. And we cannot, Mr. Speaker, leave our people behind when there is so much opportunity that exists for them to invest in small businesses, for them to gain employment and to look after their families. Mr. Speaker, the UK market is also showing a bright sign of recovery. As we see hospital rates come down and the levels of deaths come down and the levels of vaccinations go up in the United Kingdom, what we're seeing is that British Airways is also announcing that they are going to resume flights to St. Lucia as early as May, Mr. Speaker. They then go to a daily flight in the month of June, Mr. Speaker, bringing back the total number of weekly flights from British Airways, Mr. Speaker, to 7 flights per week, Mr. Speaker. What is incredible about British Airways this time is that there will be less double drops. Because, Mr. Speaker, in the pre-COVID times, we used to share the flight with Port of Spain. But now, Mr. Speaker, a number of these flights are exclusive to St. Lucia, thus enhancing the total seat capacity coming to our destination, giving our Airbnbs, giving our hotels, giving our farmers a greater opportunity for them to do better in the summer. And so, Mr. Speaker, we also anticipate the imminent confirmation of TUI flights out of Manchester and London, and we await those confirmations, Mr. Speaker, with much enthusiasm. Mr. Speaker, still under Head 46, the Department of Tourism, where we propose to spend 14 million, have been allocated in capital projects to continue financing arrangements for the continued reopening of tourism. Mr. Speaker, the cruise industry, which has been in dialogue with the islands of the Caribbean for the last 10 months, have signaled that they will resume cruise calls by July 16. Mr. Speaker, all customers are anticipated to be vaccinated and tested before entry, Mr. Speaker. Additionally, there will be a robust protocol to ensure that we protect our population from all potential risk from the tourism recovery. Mr. Speaker, we are doing this because of our farmers, because of our vendors who have not worked in a year, because of our duty-free industry employees who are feeling the pinch. Mr. Speaker, because of our taxi drivers, some of whom have not worked since March 2020. Mr. Speaker, our port workers, our tour guides and other employees at various sites and attractions, Mr. Speaker, they deserve a voice in these numbers that we are presenting, and this government has given them a voice by the programs that we have planned for this upcoming year. And so, Mr. Speaker, we do care. It is because we care that we are doing the responsible thing. We are ensuring, Mr. Speaker, that we are going to have a very strategic and calculated method to reopen the economy. And so, Mr. Speaker, the cruise calls. Royal Caribbean will be announcing 2 cruise calls weekly, home porting out of Barbados to St. Lucia and other Caribbean ports. Mr. Speaker, Seabourn, a smaller cruise ship operated by the Carnival Cruise Lines, is also expected to confirm weekly calls starting this summer. Mr. Speaker, this will put back the taxi drivers from courtesy taxi and from also holiday taxi at the La Place Carénage and Point Surfing associations back in operation, will bring back good business and employment opportunity for the duty-free workers, will bring back opportunity for our vendors in the craft and vendors arcade. And so, Mr. Speaker, what we do see here is a sign of confidence. Confidence in our tourism workers, confidence in our destination, and confidence in our government, Mr. Speaker. This is what this development is showing. Mr. Speaker, it is very easy for the opposition to say, close the borders. Very easy, Mr. Speaker. Because of COVID-19, Mr. Speaker, or despite COVID-19, they continue to receive 100% of their salaries, despite all the challenges that we face, Mr. Speaker. But when we close the borders, Mr. Speaker, the taxi drivers receive no salaries. When we close the economy, Mr. Speaker, the construction worker is not paid. When we close the borders, Mr. Speaker, the waitress who many times is a single parent and the only breadwinner in our home, she receives no pay. And so, Mr. Speaker, it is critical that we spend the necessary resources so that we can put this country back to work. And that's what this is all about. Mr. Speaker, under Department Head 46, the Ministry of Tourism, Broadcasting, Culture and Creative Industries, a total of 35 million is proposed to be spent between recurrent and capital expenditures. And so, Mr. Speaker, a number of programs are being brought into sharp focus on creating opportunities for more St. Lucians to own tourism businesses. And this year, Mr. Speaker, there's going to be a big thrust, and we've already seen that this government is continuing to do phenomenal work in a number of areas to ensure that every or as many communities as possible are given the opportunity, Mr. Speaker, to be able to participate meaningfully in the tourism sector. Mr. Speaker, a large percentage of this sum will build on the continued investments taking place already in ancillary, in canneries, in Groseille, and in Soufrière. Mr. Speaker, in Soufrière, a craft market, a town square, and the Hummingbird Beach projects are all recent wins, whilst in Groseille, the Member of Parliament has just unveiled a comprehensive development plan for the Pigeon Island Causeway towards the end of the town. While I will allow my colleagues, Mr. Speaker, to speak more in detail about their developments in their constituencies in this and in preceding debates on the appropriation bill, for obvious reasons, Mr. Speaker, projects happening now in ancillary and about to commence in canneries give me the most joy. And I will focus a bit in greater detail. Mr. Speaker, for many years, the Ancillary Bay is one of the most beautiful bays in the Eastern Caribbean, but the potential of its gem has been overlooked and neglected. Mr. Speaker, it is time to correct this wrong. It is time, Mr. Speaker, to bring opportunity for the people of Ancillary. Works have already begun, Mr. Speaker, on the comprehensive transformation on the waterfront and main street of Ancillary. And Mr. Speaker, as you have driven through the village, you would have seen that under the village tourism line item as identified in this budget, where we propose to spend $9 million in this financial year, we have already started the transformation. And so, Mr. Speaker, some 26 houses are currently being upgraded with facade improvements, Mr. Speaker, as we begin to improve the overall feel and aura and ambience of Ancillary. Mr. Speaker, we've almost completed the works on the main street with the facade improvements to several houses and about to commence similar improvements to the waterfront. In the location of the old community center building, works will commence in the coming days on a 5-star seafood restaurant so that we can create a more consistent market for our fishermen. In the location of the old police station, works on a mini hotel have already commenced, Mr. Speaker, whilst upgrading works on the fish fry building and the village square are also due to commence. Mr. Speaker, still on the head 46 and on the line item, village tourism, the beginning of Ancillary, the Forgotten Village, as the long overdue drain around the field, Mr. Speaker, has brought residents of the community much harm, is being bidded on as we speak. I anticipate that all things going well, that the contract will be awarded soon. Financing for this is under the Department Head 56, Economic Development, Transport and Civil Aviation, under the line item DVRP projects. So, Mr. Speaker, believe me when I tell you that these estimates and expenditures should give the people of Ancillary much hope. The people of Canaries, Mr. Speaker, should not harbor any jealousy for what is taking place in Ancillary, as these estimates and expenditures should also give them hope. Under Department Head 46, the Ministry of Tourism, where our government proposes a capital of $14 million, the Canaries waterfront will be transformed. Its coral reefs will be improved and coastline will be upgraded to ensure that they are not left out of the vast array of opportunities being unleashed on other communities around St. Lucia through the advancement of the tourism industry. Mr. Speaker, works include a new seaside restaurant, an upgraded jetty, transformation of the Canaries Beach, installation of 20 moorings for the yachting sector, a fresh fruit and vegetable market, and facade improvements to homes on the Canaries waterfront and surrounding areas. When completed, Mr. Speaker, the village of Canaries will become one of our most prominent tourism destinations on the island's beautiful west coast. Mr. Speaker, the estimates and expenditures for 2021 has already given the people of Jacmel, Boaden, hope. In the last financial year, Mr. Speaker, we ended the discomfort of many single mothers who walked up the Blackstone Hill with grocery shopping from the supermarket. Mr. Speaker, and that's because the road were so bad that the bus drivers refused to ply the route. And so, Mr. Speaker, when I hear the opposition talk about we're building too many roads, Mr. Speaker, we are not building enough roads in this country. Mr. Speaker, there are so many communities that are still walking through dirt tracks to be able to get to public transportation. And Mr. Speaker, in the year 2021, someone should not be carrying 2 pairs of shoes when they're going on their way to town. And so what we've got to do, Mr. Speaker, is to end the mud, is to bring an end to flooding in areas where people's property are at risk, is to bring an end to suffering, Mr. Speaker, and destruction caused to vehicles by communities who live in areas that are developed by private developers, Mr. Speaker, and where in those instances, those people who have invested heavily, they also receive broken promises from developers of those developments. And so, Mr. Speaker, this road project is going to go into areas like Masque, is going to go into places like Ottawa, is going to go into places, Mr. Speaker, where people desperately need the assistance and the help to be able to bring them out of a very terrible situation they're confronting. And so, Mr. Speaker, we must, Mr. Speaker, help to bring about comfort for these families. We must, Mr. Speaker, at the same time provide employment and stimulate this very difficult economic situation that we're going through because of COVID through the construction industry. We must give our workers, our construction employees, a new lease on life, and we must, Mr. Speaker, bring hope. Economics is less about numbers and more about people, and that's the approach that we're doing, Mr. Speaker. We do care. And so, Mr. Speaker, going back to Department Head 43 of the Economic Development CDP program, today I'm happy to report that the community of Jacmel has one of the best playing fields in the country. And we transformed it, Mr. Speaker, from a swamp where the goats and the sheep and cows used to graze, Mr. Speaker, after years of neglect by the St. Lucia Labour Party. And so, Mr. Speaker, there is hope in this budget. There is hope in these estimates and expenditures. Mr. Speaker, in Vanna, in my constituency up in Millet, we have produced some of the best cricketers, from Johnson Charles to Gaspar Prosper, to Alvin Prosper, to Aline Prosper, to Issa and Xavier Gabriel, and Aline Donovan. They're all outstanding national cricketers, Mr. Speaker. And would you believe, Mr. Speaker, that for many, many decades, the Vanna playing field was neglected by the St. Lucia Labour Party administration. What we have done, Mr. Speaker, is under the CDP program, and you've seen outlined here the opportunity to do more projects in these estimates. But what we have done, Mr. Speaker, is to transform the Vanna playing field, where you couldn't differentiate between the plantation next to it and the playing field. Now we have given the people and the sportsmen of Vanna the respect that they deserve to have a good playing surface, as they have put in the sacrifices and the hard work that they have made. And so, Mr. Speaker, there is hope in this budget for my constituency of Ancillary and Canaries. Mr. Speaker, this is all because we care. Mr. Speaker, it is because we care that the total allocation for health care in the current estimates, Mr. Speaker, has gone up by $14 million to over $189 million when you compare what is spent, Mr. Speaker, on the health care budget for this year, the recurrent and the capital. It is a whopping $189 million. Mr. Speaker, it is because we do care. In line item for the Ministry of Education, we have allocated $27 million in additional funds, bringing the total of over $237 million. It is because we care, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, it is because we do care. We have increased the number of individuals on the public assistance list, Mr. Speaker. And still, Mr. Speaker, there are so many more families that we must get on the public assistance list. Mr. Speaker, I am back now to the area of tourism, Department Head 46. Mr. Speaker, you would notice that in this budget, we have actually indicated that while we are going to spend some $5 million in grant contributions, 5.6 to be precise, in grant contributions this year, that we're proposing in the upcoming financial year, that we're going to spend zero. The explanation for this, Mr. Speaker, is very simple, and that is, again, the visionary leadership of this administration by ensuring, Mr. Speaker, that we give the St. Lucia Tourism Authority its financial independence so that it can better plan its marketing activities, and so it would be better able to finance the marketing initiatives, Mr. Speaker, to boost this destination, to recover from COVID, to bring about jobs and opportunities for small businesses, to create more Airbnb lodgings in this country. And so, Mr. Speaker, what you do see, Mr. Speaker, is that within the first month, at 15% of tourism arrivals, we see that the fund has already created some $1.2 million, Mr. Speaker, the head tax in its first month of reporting. And so, Mr. Speaker, this is a very good sign that as tourism recovers, that our objective of creating that independence for tourism and removing it out of the consolidated fund, or the need, Mr. Speaker, of having to fund the tourism authority or the marketing initiatives, this has finally come to an end, Mr. Speaker. And as we see the recovery of the industry from COVID, we will see, Mr. Speaker, that there's no need for tourism marketing to compete with funding for education anymore, funding for roads, or funding for healthcare. Mr. Speaker, we will see that there is going to be a reduction of about an average of $35 million, which normally goes to funding the authority. And this, Mr. Speaker, is visionary leadership. I personally want to commend and to laud the Minister of Finance and the Prime Minister, also former Minister of Tourism, Mr. Speaker, for leading our government in this process by making sure that we have a tourism head tax. Mr. Speaker, we are far and ahead of many Caribbean countries that have not gone through this step. But this is the kind of leadership that we will require, Mr. Speaker, to rebuild this country with all the challenges that we will face from COVID-19. Unfortunately, the empty noises that we are hearing on the other side will not cut it as we seek to rebuild this economy. Mr. Speaker, if I give you an example, this morning the Leader of the Opposition in his rant indicated, Mr. Speaker, that the debt to GDP ratio in his own assessment was going to go up to 100%. And when we ask him, over 100%.
Mr. Speaker, on a point of order.
Yes.
I can make a document available to the House where the Caribbean Development Bank has said that Lucia's debt to GDP ratio will be 102%.
Mr. Speaker, on a point of order, just want to make sure that the member knows on the opposite side that CDB withdrew that statement because they knew it was erroneous and have since corrected it and put it at 86%. Thank you.
Not take the Prime Minister's word for it. I'd like to see it on the website first.
Speaker, I'll be very happy to provide that tomorrow.
Mr. Speaker, I challenge the Leader of the Opposition to make it a document of the House so that we can have an informed debate. But, Mr. Speaker, when you are going to make public statements about the finances or the fiscal situation of this country, the point remains, Mr. Speaker, is that you must have your facts and you must be able to back it up, Mr. Speaker. The debt to GDP ratio is not 100%, Mr. Speaker. There is no empirical evidence to suggest that.
Honorable members.
And so, Mr. Speaker, whilst, Mr. Speaker, we have been taken to task to borrow, because the Leader of the Opposition also said this morning that how is it, Mr. Speaker, that we have a bigger budget in difficult times? Mr. Speaker, every single country is having to resort to borrow more. Every single country, Mr. Speaker, every single government is having to resort to pay for extra services. The cost of health care has gone up, Mr. Speaker. The cost of managing COVID-19 has brought about significant...
Leaders, please. Honorable Leader of the Opposition and Prime Minister.
So, Mr. Speaker, the cost, the cost of the health care cost, Mr. Speaker, has gone up significantly for all governments around the world. And so, Mr. Speaker, I find it perplexing that the Leader of the Opposition would say that in hard times we are spending more and we have a bigger budget from the previous financial year. And so, Mr. Speaker, the answer is easy. The answer is very easy, Mr. Speaker. The COVID budget is a huge budget. Mr. Speaker, I think it was somewhere in the region of $31 million. Mr. Speaker, we had to bring the Cuban healthcare medical brigade. We had to bring as well, Mr. Speaker, redo the Owen King EU hospital to be able to have a respiratory hospital to manage COVID patients. While they had a plaque on the wall spending over $100,000 for a naming ceremony, we opened the Owen King EU hospital. The cost of health care has gone up. It is because we care about the people of this country. And so, Mr. Speaker, I keep saying that empty noises are not going to solve the difficulties that we're going to face in the rebuilding of this country, in the recovery efforts. It will require level, calm, visionary, and insightful leadership. Mr. Speaker, decision-making that's going to be driven by empirical evidence, not political or politicians that are going to look for opportunities to twist the figures, Mr. Speaker, but people who are going to be true and who are going to face every single decision and level with the people of this country in the hopes, Mr. Speaker, that together we can, we will, and we all will get out of this. Mr. Speaker, I am full of hope for my constituents. I'm full of hope for the people of St. Lucia, because these estimates, Mr. Speaker, bring hope. The recovery that we're seeing in tourism, it brings hope. And Mr. Speaker, I remain inspired and very convinced that I am left with no choice but to give my unwavering support to this year's, or the proposed estimates of revenues and expenditures as laid by the Honorable Prime Minister and Minister for Finance. Mr. Speaker, I thank you very much.